Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are going to get started with our second panel for today, which is called Sensory and Affective Attentions. I hope you all enjoyed the first panel as much as I did. And it's wonderful to still see 244 people with us today. So it's really, really exciting. My name is Saiba Varma. I am an anthropologist at the University of California, San Diego. I am a South Asian woman with long black hair, and I'm wearing a pink and blue dress. Our first speaker for today is, or not today, but our first speaker on this panel is Henny Alava, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Jyväskylä. And their paper is entitled Family Failure and Fatigue in the Field, a Patchwork of Exclusions. Thank you, Henny.
Thank you. Can I just check that you're seeing the screen as it should be?
Yes,
okay,
we are. Thank you.
Okay, I am a Finnish woman with light hair tied up, wearing a white shirt with a blue leafy pattern. I will be showing some slides which include the quotes I refer to in the text. Only one slide has an image, and I will describe it once we get to it. How to speak of burned out fieldwork in a way that doesn't stink of privileged navel gazing. How to come to terms with the damage academia has done to loved ones. What to say to seniors who tell you your life is completely separate from your work. And what to do when the expectations of academia and well-being are incompatible, when you are too tired or too needed at home to go to the field. These questions have burned at the edge of my mind for years, and I thank the organizers of this event for allowing me to present them to you. In place of clear-cut answers, any such were preempted by a litany of distractions so beautifully analyzed for us in the first panel by Kate. What I have to share in response to the questions are patches of reflections and a hope that some answers can be collectively found. Throughout my academic career, particularly during times I have lived in Uganda with my partner and our first 2, then 3 children, my family and my fatigue at grappling with the demands of academic work and care work have been marked as hindrances, not just by peers, supervisors, and bosses, or some of them, but most importantly, by me. In a section of my PhD thesis, this section being entitled Family, Failure, and Fatigue in the Field, I drew particularly from Elaine Cerwonka and Lisa Malki's work to reflect on how realizing this marking and on somehow coming to terms with my vulnerability and my responsibilities of care mattered. I described how recognizing the ableist masculine yardstick of hero anthropology, against which I deemed myself a failure during my 2012 and 13 fieldwork, had shaped the analytical pathways I followed to conceptualize anyoba, an Acholi term for confusion, in the context of Christianity and politics in the aftermath of the Northern Ugandan War. When I began transforming the thesis into a book, that section was cut. Quote, "It's a different genre," unquote, an anthropologist reviewer and friend told me before I submitted the manuscript for review. Considering how vital writing that part had been for me, and how much time I have spent furiously raging at such sections being struck out of finished ethnographic products, it is something of an irony that I was relieved. Yes, let's save it for later. Let's stick to the genre. On the PowerPoint slide, there is an image of a drip bottle of sodium lactate intravenous infusion. In July 2019, I returned to Uganda with my family for postdoctoral research. Earlier that year, I had been away from work for 3 months on doctor's orders, recovering from burnout. I went back to work too soon. Just about a month after the insomnia, panic attacks, and associated pain of burnout had relented. I felt I had to, because the project and family timeframes were really tight. Yet, as it turned out, my own fatigue, which made countless days of fieldwork feel like I was trudging through a heavy grayness with leaden legs, proved to be a really minor problem. I'm sorry, seeing this picture on the screen really was an unforeseen trigger. Shortly after my children started their new school, one of my kids started feeling really sick. Only about a month later, after many doctors and 2 hospitalizations, and after we had seriously considered flying back home, did I suddenly realize the one thing that connected all the dots. Clarion, prescribed to my children as the safest option there is by a pediatric tropical expert. After switching the malaria medication, life slowly stabilized. But for weeks on end, the biggest chunk of my time went to doing something completely different than research, taking care of a really sick child and recovering from the shell shock of doing so. At the end of the year, we returned to Finland, and then COVID hit. Juggling distance school and daycare closure alongside my work, luckily for a very short time in Finland, I burnt out again, though less severely since I knew to press the brake and go on sick leave earlier this time. A privilege our Nordic welfare system allows, for which I am limitlessly thankful. But again, my burnout proved to be a minor problem. As schools reopened, the same child who had been sick in Uganda
cheese sandwich for lunch?
developed a nasty headache.
Sure.
I'm sorry,
No,
somebody's got a
fine.
microphone on in the background. Some weeks later, the headache receded, only to come back later like a sledgehammer. Persistent, ceaseless, searing, and increasingly debilitating pain. After months of doctors, labs, tests, and scans, and after finally getting referred to the correct public specialist healthcare, again a privilege without which I really don't know how we would be standing, my child's care team gently laid it out to me and my partner in November last year. Quote, "We can't know for sure, but we believe the root issue behind your child's pain is the trauma of their illness in Uganda." My fieldwork, my academic aspirations had made my child sick. Where in the anthropological record, I wonder, is there space for pondering such a thing? Quote, "For this reviewer, the author doesn't get the balance quite right," unquote. This is what an anonymous reviewer said about the reflexivity in my book manuscript, pointing particularly to a section in which I wrote about an incident during fieldwork when a key informant arrived at our door to find me a blubbering, exhausted, emotional mess, like today. The reviewer's feedback has led me to ponder, is there an absolute, uncontested point of balance for reflexivity, for writing one's vulnerability into the ethnographic account? A sweet point that is quite right. Right for what? Right for who? Over the past year, working on my book, I've done a lot of editing out. Sara Ahmed's queer orientations and thinking of theory as orientation rather than scaffolding, out. Tiffany Page's notion of vulnerable writing, primarily out. I have left these parts to what I have been envisioning as another genre, so as to try to claim myself as a serious voice in my field of study. Yet during the past year, and during significant chunks of my life before it, this pursuit of seriousness seems to have taken its toll. While I have been crunching up co-authored articles where none of the vulnerable me was left for readers to see, using those parts of my fieldwork diary where there is no mention of my complete exhaustion or of what was happening at home, I was actually in survival mode, and my family, my child, were falling apart. It was in the midst of pondering all this that I came across the work of dancer and dance therapist Pauliina Jääskeläinen. In an article written as a dialogue between her and a colleague, and I cannot recommend this piece warmly enough to you, Pauliina writes of how the death of her son affected her research. In her co-author's words, quote, Pauliina is longing for an approach to writing based on inclusion rather than exclusion of the ambivalent emotions and experiences that she had encountered, end quote. Pauliina goes on to quote Pullen to describe how scholars are taught to write properly, to, quote, tidy up our embodied writing which leaks. We edit, cleanse, correct, and say what other people want us to say, end quote. Does patchwork ethnography lead to patchwork writing, where the embodied anthropologists with all their families, failures, and fatigues are not cleansed out, but allowed to leak in somehow, somewhere? If it does not, then I fear that anthropology's demands of rigor, excellence, and sacrifice will in the end remain intact, seeping out of ethnographies to egg on new generations of aspiring ethnographers to burn themselves out in the pursuit of professional recognition. COVID-19 has shaken the ideal of the brave anthropologist and her exotic field site, spoken of in the first panel today so wonderfully, in a way that I feel that, at least in Finland, critical debates about research justice and decolonizing academia have not been able to do. But I want to be honest. It is not primarily the grave ethical critique against ethnographic presence that has caused me to seriously consider what my next research project might look like, but rather the simple fact of my life. Over and over again, I have constructed my so-called expertise through an exclusion of my vulnerability. And by exclusion of my being in the world so fundamentally and more than in any other way as a parent to my children. I don't want to perform that exclusion anymore. My family can no longer up and move. Maintaining stability, including by me not being away all the time, has become a crystal clear priority and remains one even while my child is, thankfully, and I should mention this, much better than he was half a year ago. In addition, and as a response to one of the questions in the last panel, I have a mother with late-stage Alzheimer's, a vulnerable father, and a father-in-law in the late stretches of cancer, each of whom add reason for me to stay rooted right where I am. So for the past half year, I have been envisioning new research where these two things, vulnerability and my life as a parent, be made the starting point and not treated as dirty residue that needs to be edited out. My dream carries the title Parenting Pain, and jumping into it means letting go of practically all the regional and thematic so-called expertise that I have painstakingly built up for over a decade. For me, the path to embracing patchwork has meant allowing myself to stop trying to stretch into doing fieldwork far away from home, even from a distance, over the internet, at least for now, and to rather envision fieldwork as really starting from home, as weaving a quilt where all the patches are allowed to feature, those of home, those of work, those of strength, and those of failure. To end, and I'm sorry I've overstepped my time, but I hope I can say this final thing. A colleague in a neighboring discipline read a recent draft of this paper and said to me, in not quite these words, but close to it, "This is hogwash. This myth of the hero anthropologist," she insisted, "has been deconstructed decades ago. The problem is in your head." Was she right? Are the masculinist yardsticks and monsters of anthropological rigor a fragment of my imagination, conjured simply by my inner demons and misconceptions of what is expected of an aspiring scholar
Right here.
field? Or is there something here that resonates more broadly? Preparing for today, I concluded by stating that I'm probably still too deep in my own quagmires of figuring this all out to answer the question, and that I'd just leave it to you. But the wonderful presentations we heard in the first panel suggest I'm not alone in struggling with this. The realization which makes me feel really thankful and a great deal less alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henny, for that really powerful, moving paper. And I think we're also moved with you on that journey, and just want to thank you for sharing and being so brave. And I hope you get a chance to look at the comments, because there's so much love and support for you and for your story. It's resonating really broadly with people. So just really want to thank you for opening your heart. And I know earlier there was a question about how patchwork can be a decolonial method and an anti-racist method. And I think you've really demonstrated the ways in which what we bear, right, the parts of ourselves that bear can really reshape what research even means, and also our refusals, right, to take on certain kinds of vulnerabilities. So thank you so much for that paper. We are going to move on now to our next panelist, Jessica Lumanisha, who is a doctoral researcher at Goldsmiths, the University of London. Their paper is entitled Quilted Aftermaths: Surviving, Researching, and Navigating Institutional Rigidness After Rape. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much. I am a mixed race Black and white woman with short curly hair, and I'm wearing a baby blue summer dress. I wanted to thank Henny for her rawness and openness before I start. I'm resonating with the chat and comments of the attendees. I want to issue a trigger warning. I will be talking about sexual violence, rape, mental illness, racism, and death in the talk. So if anyone needs to go off at any point during the talk, please feel free to do what's best for you to feel safe in this space. Right, I'm going to start. Can people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, Jessica. You were a little soft earlier, but I think you're good now.
Yeah?
Yeah.
People hear the trigger warning?
I think that, yeah, if you want to repeat it one more time, feel free.
Okay, so I'm issuing a trigger warning. I will be talking about sexual violence, rape, mental illness, racism, and death. So please, if you need to leave at any point, please feel free to do so. Right. I recall reading the introduction by Zoe H. Wall and Julie Livingston to a book called Collateral Afterworlds, Sociality Besides Redemption, last summer. And the chapter's epigraph is a poignant poem by Gregory Orr. It's entitled A Litany. Orr is a poet whose work explores the aftermath of accidentally shooting his brother as children. And the paper explains how he sees poetry as a way to make meaning where meaning has been shattered. And it takes a lot to shatter a person's meaning. Trauma shatters meaning. It shatters time, it shatters relationality, it shatters life as we know it. Rape is one of those traumatic events that can shatter and fragment life in the most intimate way possible. And I want to interrogate what happens after in this talk. In dictionaries and in shared knowledge, we have come to understand the period of time that follows a collectively or personally disastrous accident or event as an aftermath. But where is the line between aftermath and normal life? Do some of us live in a perpetual aftermath? When is it no longer acceptable to be living in an aftermath, and why is it understood as a limited time, period of time, or a singular thing? because I personally see aftermath as a plural. I see that, I understand that when time, self, and meaning are shattered, things are no longer linear or singular or as simple as the period of time after. When flashbacks come haunting back, or sounds, smells, or words bring distressing emotions and bodily sensations from the past, not only into the present, but influence your future, aftermath alone is not enough to encompass post-traumatic living and surviving. The trauma or traumas get relived every day. Aftermaths in the plural, or the deeply layered and entangled survival tactics people live in and with after major traumas. More so, according to Lewis Hoffman's and Lisa Vallejos, existential shattering is the sudden and unexpected dismantling or shattering of one's self-conception and worldview as a consequence of an event or process that the individual has experienced. Existential shattering can be further described as a devastating, unexpected, irreversible event, a trauma, in which one's fundamental systems of meanings and relating are irreparably shattered. The irreparability of this I will leave up to the individual in question and their path in their own aftermaths. But in this talk, I would really like to focus on the idea of existential shattering and being faced with institutional rigidity as a researcher. I would like to argue through my own personal experience and experiences that we do not all have the privilege to leave and take off for fieldwork, nor do all possess the safety to conduct research in a given body. We do not all subscribe to certain academic molds, and we all have different needs as people. At the time of my assault, I had been living permanently in London for a few years, and I was just starting to design my PhD research, which is set back home in Poland. Being Polish Congolese myself, I was building a research project focused on Blackness and nationalism, with the experiences and lives of people of African descent in Poland at the heart of it. My research centers how they've lived and survived under socialism, its fall, and the now ongoing rise of far-right populism in the region. It is a project that is largely focused on a male migration pattern. And then from one day to the next, my life was changed forever. In my experience, when all meaning is lost, the only way to live, but also by association to conduct research, is to quilt things together, patch them where and when possible. In the aftermath of my rape as a young academic, just starting out her PhD, I developed PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which later on was re-diagnosed as CPTSD, so complex post-traumatic stress disorder, due to previous and ongoing traumas around my childhood, other sexual violence, my race, and my sexuality. Not everyone will develop these symptoms following a trauma. It is a case-by-case thing. But for me, disassociation and losing my sense of self mean that I play catch-up with myself all the time. I quilt my day-to-day and I patch it where I can. Whilst I and many others quilt as a way to live, there is still a prevalent lack of understanding coupled with an unwillingness to experience the discomfort, to witness, to talk about the repercussions of rape in the everyday, which then in turn translate into a complete lack of understanding, support, care, and flexibility from institutions such as universities, departments, well-being teams, funding bodies, and other external bodies working with and for us survivors. I'm not talking about interpersonal pastoral care and support networks, which are a great start and may exist in these settings, but about the deeply ingrained institutional apparatus that hide under layers of bureaucracy and erase those interpersonal networks and render them ineffective when in the face of practicalities. This is not an attack on my institution, but a transparent call for change. There is a need to truly start understanding researchers as people with personal traumas and vulnerabilities and adapt. And we need to see those vulnerabilities as a human thing rather than a weakness or an obstacle. Oh, have you lost me?
No, we can hear you, Jessica. You might be
Oh, okay.
frozen, but
Sorry.
yeah, you're fine now. Yeah, you're good.
Okay. See those vulnerabilities as a human thing rather than a weakness or an obstacle in conducting research. We need to adapt, flow, be more understanding, caring, gentle, and flexible. Following my assault, I was met with so much rigidity. I was already navigating a space not designed for me and found myself having to navigate retrospective interruptions, a consequential past loss of funding and time that came with the said interruptions, and a whole air of bureaucracy to try and make up for it, all of which reinforced feelings of responsibility for my own rape, on top of the deterioration of my mental health and feelings of isolation. I felt like I was drowning. Seeing my majoritarily white peers, some of whom look down on my work as anthropology at home, go off one by one to study the other, to conduct classic fieldwork with no major inconvenience, made me doubt my ability as a researcher. I fell through the cracks when it comes to support. I felt like I should be grateful for not having to pay money back for my funding body. I felt internal pressure to come back at full capacity because I guess my reasonable aftermath period had run its course. Being punched at my most vulnerable with just how rigid and violent white male ableist institutional molds are has meant that my priorities have shifted. Realizing that support for people like me is not a given in those spaces, manifested itself into radical commitment to my mental health and well-being, which means I cannot just take up and leave my care and support networks for extended periods of time. My assault put my safety at the forefront of what I do, which meant I've had to rework who I work with and how I work. And in growth and healing, I've recognized the value and integrity of my work and method. Patchwork ethnography has allowed me to rethink hierarchies of knowledge within my own work. It's allowed me to rethink positionality. It's allowed me to become a much more empathetic, caring, and radical researcher. It got me to see how the methods and the institutional modes were encased in, or by definition, forms of epistemicide. They're hostile to anyone from whom those spaces were not designed for in the first place. They kill any other kind of knowledge and knowledge production that is not deemed enough in the imagined hierarchy. They discourage non-white male, disabled, queer survivors from practice that is anything other than the rigid structures that suppress us. They assume a monolithic, unilateral hierarchy between researcher and participant. Ethnographic work is based on relationality. It is based on sharing and producing knowledge with others, and a patchwork approach allows us not only space for all kinds of researchers and research, but also time for a deeper engagement through this multifaceted approach. Whoever said that collecting data, sharing, producing knowledge has to be continuous, hierarchical, and polished. It's raw, messy, it's a disrupted process. It is deeply personal, in my opinion, requires putting yourself in the work. It requires vulnerability, empathy, and a trauma-informed lens. Patchwork as a framework has meant that I've started using my own stories, my own position as a member of my community as an asset. In my ethnographic work, in my research, and my writing, I quilt my childhood memories, my participant stories, archival documents, images, and sounds with statistics and numbers. I juxtapose different genres of writing, vernacular, speech, with different kinds of sources and media. I make room for dreams, for legends, for aspiration, for speculation, for not knowing, for breaking open, and for going beyond reliable sources and reliable archives. I do so without placing them in the hierarchy of knowledge. If the people I work with are seen as the problem in institutional dynamics and spaces, how can those spaces be in turn seen as anything other than sources of oppression? Patchwork ethnography in practice has also meant initially short trips when possible, so I don't lose my support network and care here. It meant getting stuck with family and being interrupted by COVID-19, by the pandemic. It means having to switch to digital ethnography at times and include more archival work in the midst. I don't see it as mitigating or managing despite the odds. To me, it's simple. Research is subjective and mine is shaped by who I am and my experiences. It then simply means that I'll produce, and how I produce will be a patchwork. It doesn't make it any lesser than. I will be concluding now, I promise. I hope that this personal account of what happens after the unthinkable happens, of what it's like to be a young woman of color in academia, doing ethnographic research at home in a primary white institution, helps somewhat towards a patchwork approach towards theorizing a patchwork approach across all scopes. I hope that talking about starting out in academia and getting raped and how patchwork ethnography has helped me navigate the design and ongoing execution of my doctoral research has helped me navigate, has helped some of you see that there is no one type of research or research and that there's always ways to work outside of these molds. I hope that by showing the lack of support and understanding of personal traumas and vulnerabilities, I have demonstrated how layered institutional rigidity is and how inadequate responses to the needs and realities of gender-based violence and women of color are. My own experiences allow me to attest that patchwork ethnography, collecting bits and sewing them together when and where one can, is for many the only way to mend not only post-traumatic surviving with conducting research and living with others, but simply the only way to do research. Folk on the margin may require an ease and safety of travel between life and research that conventional practices do not offer, practices tailored by spaces that were never designed for us. My methods and research design have been interrupted, disrupted, and shaped by being a woman of color in academia, a survivor, a member of the community I study. But in the center of the conversation is my own vulnerability. Patching research and post-traumatic stress disorder, the need to feel safety with the inability to leave for extended periods of time, and the consequential loss of funding and time following my assault. I recently heard Philomena Asset speak, and she said something that really resonated with me. She said, care and healing are a form of resistance, and it all has been quilted aftermaths in the plural for me. But they were full of care, healing, and growth, both as a person, but also as a researcher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for another just incredibly brave and powerful paper. You've given us so much to think about, and also just the way you talked about writing in a patchwork way was just incredibly inspiring as well. So thank you so much. We will move on to our next speaker, Michelle Friedner, who is a social and medical anthropologist in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. And their paper is entitled Half, Half, Half Anthropology. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conference so far. I've been learning a lot, and I really appreciate the work that the organizers put into this and to the papers of my fellow panelists and the panel before, so thank you. So I'm a social and medical anthropologist. I'm sitting right now in my office, and I'm wearing a black, slightly wrinkled shirt, and I have frizzy reddish brown hair, and I'm wearing glasses. So since 2007, I've been conducting research on deafness and disability in India. My earlier work was focused on the experiences of new, emerging, and developing Indian Sign Language speakers as they learned and worked to build new sign language focused ways of being in the world and earning livelihoods. I spent time in deaf schools, vocational training centers, workplaces, deaf churches, and pyramid scheme recruitment sessions. For example, I myself was a newer signer, and there were some ways in which I fit into my field site. When attending deaf churches, for example, like many of the others there, I learned new vocabulary and new concepts, and I was included in question and answer sessions. People often asked me if I understood, and when I said that I didn't understand, they were happy to share what they knew. And I also shared as well. While there was much focus on negotiated sameness in terms of language and sensory access, there were also moments of friction. For example, a young deaf activist in Delhi who was impatient with my less than fluent signing, and perhaps because she saw my hearing aids, told me that I was half, half, half. She said that I was half signing, half speaking, half listening and half seeing. I was neither here nor there for her, although she had 4 halves for me. Half, half, half is something that many of my interlocutors said regarding schools where teachers didn't sign and in which they didn't learn. They learned half, half, half. Half, half, half functioned as a way of critiquing and also a means of insisting that there could be something out there that was better in terms of communication, relations, development, etc. I appreciated this honesty. Yes, everything was only half, 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 and there was a desire to build the world that was more whole. Although one could also argue that a commitment to seeing a sign language based and deaf value based way of being in the world as whole is or was also problematic. And for people, including me, who work together to try to stitch something together from the fragments of information, education, and opportunities available, there was a sense that that stitching was a valuable and important thing to do in the moment. There were many times when I sat with deaf friends at a function where a government administrator or other chief guest droned on in speech, and we couldn't understand. What was key was that we couldn't understand together, and we talked about other things to pass time. Then in 2016, I started a new project looking at government programs and an emerging private market providing children with cochlear implants and habilitation. Along with cochlear implants, government administrators, surgeons, audiologists, and speech and language pathologists were promoting a vision of wholeness or normality. There was a sense that deaf children could become normal through implantation. What was interesting too was that I had gotten an implant myself while writing my dissertation in 2010, much to many of my signing friends' discomfort and sometimes disgust. Conducting research in habilitative settings like clinics, therapy centers, and cochlear implant industry conferences was very different from my previous project in terms of how I engaged with people and how I was included in research sites. There was little room for improvisation, mouthing, gesturing, and working to make communication happen in such settings, where there was such a strong commitment to bringing the normative into the world. I felt like I had to constantly surveil myself and make sure that I was not signing or gesturing with children. And the rare speech and language therapists who did sign told me about it in confidence. I want to talk about 2 things that I have been struggling with in particular in this research. The first is how therapists and clinicians saw me. That is, I could no longer pass as hearing, and there was a way that many of them immediately knew something about me as soon as they heard me speak. As a therapist said, I knew as soon as you opened your mouth that you were deaf. And I was then asked many questions about my hearing, age of loss, when I got hearing aids, implants, etc. I was often grilled. And there were times when people announced that I was deaf to other people as a means of exerting expertise. For example, I was at a cochlear implant industry conference, and an auditory verbal therapist who I knew asked 2 surgeons if they could tell that I was deaf, and they said that they did not know. But the therapist, who was more attuned to so-called deaf speech, could, and she gleefully revealed that I was deaf. There was something very discomforting about this, about being known, seen, or recognized. And there's a history of tense hierarchies and power dynamics between surgeons, audiologists, and therapists, and the deaf people with whom they work, and deaf communities in general. The second thing that I've been thinking about involves questions of what we in Western and Northern disability worlds call access. And I think it raises questions about access in general. It was expected that children could and would learn to listen and speak and become normal after implantation. Surgeons, audiologists, and therapists often claim that there was no such thing as Indian Sign Language, that it was not a complete language, that it was difficult, and so on. As such, it often seemed to me that bringing a sign language interpreter or other kinds of access could be unwelcome, and that it would also make conditions of research difficult. In one case, I brought an ISL interpreter to a parents function at an oral early intervention program in Delhi after getting grudging permission from the director, who wanted to be clear that the interpreter was only for me. I've recently found myself reflecting on an annual cochlear implant industry conference where surgeons, therapists, audiologists, and company representatives gather. When I went to the last conference in 2019 in Mumbai, I brought a student and she typed segments of lectures up for me during the conference, and we discussed what was being said during breaks and over dinner. I also recorded and had the talks transcribed after the conference. During breaks, in addition to talking with my student, I focused more on one-on-one conversations and trying to catch up on what I might have missed. I was the only deaf person at the conference and the only implant user. According to a cochlear implant corporate executive, deaf implant users were out doing normal things, like going to school and working, and they had no time for such a conference. As the sole deaf person at the conference, I would have had to advocate for individual access and not collective access, as I often did in my previous work. There's something very awkward about fighting for individual access of field sites, especially field sites in which people are ideologically opposed to said access. I've been thinking about the next industry conference and how I would potentially like to bring an interpreter. But the idea of someone signing on the stage next to a surgeon or cochlear implant manufacturer, a representative of the manufacturer, is impossible for me to imagine without it interfering with other kinds of access. It basically seems like it would be a large fuck you to everybody there. And it's interesting to think about that in relation to what access means. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, access is the power, opportunity, permission, or right to come near or into contact with someone or something, admittance or admission. What is key here is that access to something might result in lack of access to something else. A door opened might mean a door closed. Having an interpreter, which might have given me access to lectures, would have foreclosed other kinds of access interpersonally, in terms of being able to connect with these speakers during coffee breaks, receptions, and so on. This is especially the case because discourses around sign and speech and sign and implantation are so polarized. Bringing an interpreter into the mix would have meant that I would not have been able to pass in other ways. What happened when a researcher's preferred or needed mode of communicating and accessing information is seen as non-normative or deviant, and those being studied are invested in creating and maintaining the normative. An interpreter would have provided a rupture as much as he or she would have provided access. And yes, I recognize that passing and being able to bring students to work with me is a privilege. Returning to the definition of access that I shared more generally, it's productive to actually problematize fantasies of effortless access in field sites and to foreground the inaccess or lack of access that often exists, as well as the workarounds in which we engage. Here I think about the semiotic, linguistic, and bodily ideologies that we bring to our field work and that exist within the discipline of anthropology in general. Asking multiple others for information, context, fill in the blanks is something that I often do. Sometimes I think of research as the game of telephone. This is true because I cannot eavesdrop, because I sometimes don't hear things, especially in noisy places, and because I'm not fluent in Indian Sign Language, Hindi, and other Indian languages. And I wish that anthropologists would be more upfront about their language skills. I'm upfront about this half-half-halfness of my research, and I have found that working with colleagues has been helpful and productive, and that we interdependently work to stitch our senses together. In addition, in my current research on implantation, I've written about a value placed on listening and speaking, and I've also tried to move away from it in my own work, to consider other forms of multisensory, multimodal, and multi-relational forms of engagement. I'm interested in the work of touch, gesture, eye contact, and other non-linguistic ways of establishing co-presence. and forms of co-presence that are not necessarily based on effortlessness or based on smooth access. I'm also interested in jettisoning the concept of access, although it's quite alluring. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that really thought-provoking paper. We'll move on to our final speaker for this panel, Sarita Amrute, who is an associate professor at the University of Washington, Seattle, and their paper is entitled Hearing the Ethnography, Foregrounding the Infrastructure. Thank you, Sarita.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you also to the sign language interpreter, Sarah. I present as a South Asian woman with short black hair and brown skin. I'm wearing a brown sweater, and today I'm sitting in Brooklyn, New York, the traditional home of the Canarsie people. I acknowledge their incredible knowledge, the pathways they laid down, the pathways laid down by formerly enslaved people and immigrants that make this place what it is today. So this is very much a rough draft, so bear with me, it's very new. Are anthropologists good listeners? Many should like to think so. But the practice of ethnography is a holistic device. Anthropologists study what they hear within the larger context of what they see, feel, and wonder about. Ethnographers often relegate the sounds of ethnography to the back seat, except when sound is explicitly named as the subject of analysis. As in the scholarship of Stephen Feld, Marina Peterson, Anthony Kwame Harrison, Roshanna Keshti, whose work will animate the last section of this talk, and others. Listening, some practitioners argue, is not even quite the right metaphor for what anthropologists do. In Stefan Helmreich's study of the sounds of deep sea diving submarines, transduction emerges as a more apt description of what ethnographers do. Transduction connotes simultaneously the transformation of sound across different ontologies and the material apparatus that allows for such transformations, from storied devices like tape recorders and notebooks to the digiplayer and mobile phone of today, and including the power-laden infrastructures of access and command that a visiting anthropologist deploys. Maybe anthropologists aren't very good listeners. Maybe most of the time, the authority of the discipline oscillates between the fidelity of a perfectly tuned recording and the finality of the hermeneutic. In the former, the anthropologist strains to hear the legitimacy of the founding word as it emerges from the mouths of our interlocutors, unblemished by interpretation. In the latter, we write, and in that writing, we overwrite and carry forward the presence of that original authority of the spoken word. We bend and interpret these sounds as we do the sounds of others in the everyday. Yet seldom are the moments when the sounds of the everyday are acknowledged as interacting with the sounds of the ethnographic conversation. And we mostly make cuts between them in a particular way so that we can identify an object for analysis. Between these polarities of fidelity interpretation, where is the place for a different kind of listening? What kind of anthropology would such a listening yield? Listening for fidelity strains to understand the underlying meaning. Listening for interpretation stretches to overcome the space between the anthropologist and her subjects by giving shape to what is heard, coming to a relation through listening closely. A third mode of listening hears simultaneously what is orally imperfect and what is orally valued as the correct, and therefore hears modes of listening as themselves instruments of disciplinarity. In the midst of the COVID pandemic, I began to practice what I can only think of, and I mean it with a sense of pride, bad anthropology. Not handmaiden of colonialism bad, but inappropriate. It is not immersive, not purposed, not continuous. Bad anthropology is sporadic, not very interested in capturing high fidelity, hardly ever recorded correctly. It tells a plural, intermittent, rewritten, and overwritten story. Bad anthropology takes a long time because it has to happen between the work of the everyday. It is not an anthropology that goes away and comes back again. It is an anthropology that reveals the boundaries of anthropological knowledge because it cannot pretend to the holism of immersion, of all the senses or even one sense completely, or to metaphysical presence. This is ethnography as patchy, as in coming in not very clearly at all. It may also be a post-Byrne anthropology that does not try to fix anthropology's crises with new directions. But my anthropology is also scabrous. It is a bit of flaky skin that is rough as a dry patch, that I salve and tend and scratch. My bad anthropology does not respond to a new or even renewed call for doing relevant anthropology and letting the rest burn, as Ryan Jobson argues, and instead reverberates to the sound of the question of what it means to be relevant and listens for what notes, tones, and pauses sustain the line between relevance and irrelevance. As the COVID epidemic unfolded, I moved to understand the world as it was laid out before me. Physical travel halted. That world, my world, overlapped with so many others as a series of text messages, phone calls, email chains, and online conversation. The COVID pandemic coincided with an increase in political action in many corners of the world that aimed simultaneously at creating mutual aid for relief, criticizing government inaction, and moving to change the social needle of centuries-old patterns of discrimination. In those worlds that began appearing on the small screen of my cell phone, the patterns fought against were casteist, racist, and classist. What is more, new groups emerged across these last 2 years, and conversations waxed full as more entered lockdown. This experience of COVID ethnography is not exclusive to me. A wide range of ethnographers have seen fit to comment on the practice of ethnography during COVID. Largely, these commentaries fall into 3 categories. The first group laments the loss of what Braithwaite, Maldonado, Moody, and Rosas call the sensuousness of there-ness, the feeling of holism that emerges from being there. The second group calls anthropologists to arms to recognize the power imbalances that continue to haunt and make anthropology possible. The authors in this category think of COVID as a moment that creates new urgency around addressing the challenges of power-laden relationships in anthropological practice. For them, COVID is a crisis of method that calls on ethnographers to connect historical conditions to the emergence of new field sites like online spaces. The third category explodes the figure of the ethnographer herself by showing the seams of ethnographic practice as it is constituted largely by women who work the ethnographic seam alongside doing the labor of social reproduction, as in Sarkar's autoethnography of late alarms, long queues, and online attendances. I read these responses to COVID ethnography as tracing a geography larger than anthropology itself. They are part of the geography of the West that creates the historicity of a pandemic in 3 modes: the world, society, and the self. As such, the crisis of doing ethnography during COVID is part of a larger reimagination of the relationship between the West and the rest, the contours of which are not yet entirely clear. The relationship, as it has thus far been described, has yet to go beyond the 3 poles of the other, the social, and the self. How these 3 get reconstituted will largely also determine how anthropology itself moves forward. Perhaps another mode of imperfect and simultaneous listening can offer a different configuration that moves in the spaces between these apices. When I began calling around to ask people about how they got into activism, to ask them if they were afraid, and to ask how they stayed safe, I was astounded by what I heard. Sometimes when I listened, the connection was patchy, it cut, and it was intermittent. But at other times I could hear so clearly, it was as if I had entered a space of extreme intimacy. I called a young woman in Bangalore named Anuradha, she prefers not to give her last name, who had worked on a zine called Cipher. It had been her first foray into activism, sparked by the discriminatory citizenship laws passed by the Indian government earlier in the year. As we talked, I could hear the peals of her laughter, the bow wow wow of her dog, the ring of a doorbell. What could I make of this visceral sound? I talked to Anuradha from my own space of intimacy, sitting on the floor of my bedroom. The phone pressed to my ear, my cheek getting hot as we spent an hour together. Me trying to take notes and ignore the sounds of Zoom school coming from the room next door. I started using Signal and Proton Mail because of the story I wrote on the protests, Anuradha tells me. And I hear it intercalated with her voice, the ding of a string of messages I'm getting on my own phone. I remember I sat until 2 a.m. Her voice gets soft. It was impossible to stop drawing, impossible to say, this much is enough. And I hear in her voice exuberance and heartbreak, and birds making a racket outside. Her room sounds a bright, beautiful blue. I called again that month to a different activist in Los Angeles. I asked him some of the same questions, and he gave me some very different answers. Jay Furusawa had been an activist for a long time, and as a movement builder of the long haul, he was relatively unafraid. And he thought of being online as part of the arsenal of work he did, and a relatively minor part at that. Of course, his ability to act without fear of arrest from the United States was vastly different than Anuradha's in South India. This time, I was making the call from the car, having to run out to move it before I incurred a parking ticket. I pulled to the other side of the street and chatted as I nervously checked the rear view. I took notes as I watched the dust motes float past my steering wheel. My interview partner was telling me, if you're just a loudmouth, you are not going to do anything. But if you can bring out people, then people will pay attention. And I was flicking my eyes to the side to make sure my car was not in the way of the ambulance whose alarm I was hearing. I could hear Jay's Western twang, and I conjured up a wiry man graying at the temples, charismatic, grisly, dedicated. I asked him how he uses data, and he tells me that he collects data to put in his newsletter, which he uses as a document of persuasion. But more than anything, he tells me, you need bodies. Bodies not just to protest, but to know what to ask for. And in that moment, I'm finally able to press the button on my car's ignition and shut it off. And I relax into the interview, successfully having avoided yet another fine. The relaxation does not last very long. My next thought combines Jay's testimony about Zoom meetings weakening the strength of activist communities with a thought about how my children are managing on their own in the apartment whilst I sit sealed in the quiet cabin of my automobile. I can taste the warm tar of the road. I smell the crusts of toast and sweet jam that sit unattended on the kitchen table. Listening in these interviews is not a metaphor or a method of ethnography. Even as I agree with Deb Thomas's assertion that listening is an obligation of ethnographers that implicates them in their interlocutors' worlds, I think we need to understand listening as a disciplinary endeavor. It creates a kind of knowledge as well as power over subjects who have to make themselves into subjects worthy of being listened to. But in these dusty moments in cars, on floors, on the phone, they suggest a kind of listening connected to and moving beyond listening in the singular as a faculty uniquely suited to an anthropology of the simultaneous present, because it is mediated by wires, screens, heat, other sounds, other voices, things said clearly and unclearly, colors felt, glass alternately smooth and rough with the ridges of an oft-dropped and shattered device. Prashant Keshji, an ethnographer of sound, builds on the work of Zora Neale Hurston to suggest a synesthetic listening. This listening crosses the senses, colors smell, and sounds taste. And Hurston's ethnography of race, work, and song, her subjects see with the skin. Synesthetic listening accords with my current experience of listening to my collaborators on the phone. Rather than aim at fidelity, and rather than insert myself as a key interpreter, synesthetic listening mixes here and there, even as it allows other kinds of sounds to ring out in color and in tone. Imagining these moments of listening through other senses brings together times and places without collapsing them all into a singular experience of sound and meaning. The phone is a field site, but thinking of the phone as a mediator of presence, at least in this moment when it feels like an anachronistic technology to listen, when we have videos with recording capabilities after all, does something to how and what I hear. I hear in and out of time. I hear time as coeval, see the colors of that synchronicity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarita, for that rich and vivid description. I think we were all smelling and tasting and being there with you. So we will move on to the Q&A. We have a little under 15 minutes, and just a reminder to our audience that if you would like to make a comment or pose a question, please do that in the Q&A box rather than raising your hand, because you're not able to be heard by us actually. So if you could write out your question or comment, that would be wonderful. So we do have one question from an anonymous attendee. So they say, thank you all for sharing your presentations and experiences. So much of what you all shared resonated with me. I have been sitting with this question for the past year. Unfortunately, many of us lost loved ones due to COVID-19 complications, myself included. As a graduate student entering exploratory research, I asked myself, how do I do research during a pandemic when I am still grieving and the perpetual existence of the loss of family members? How do we, those of us who will never know an aftermath to the pandemic because we know its loss and pain, do research when the fear of the virus lingers and the fear that people we collaborate with could potentially feel or are feeling similar grief or fear due to COVID-19 death? Would anyone like to take that?
Maybe I can start, Saibas. Just quickly, this is a really pressing question, I think, and I think everyone listening will have a different story and experience. My experience, as so many in this room will be, is the phone became both an object of connection and an object of dread. So they're in the middle of the night when a sudden string of messages are coming through and you pick it up. You don't know what it's going to be, but the chances are good that it's somebody's in the hospital. And so my answer to this question starts really from that sensory experience of being both completely connected to those family members and friends, and also feeling removed from that world. And you know, one of the works that I recently read and really like on this is Enduring Cancer by Vi Banerjee, where he talks about a hesitant methodology for anthropologists. And I think my beginnings of an answer to how we do ethnography really begins with really heeding that hesitancy and thinking through, you know, as the title of his book suggests, the way people endure things that, as the questioner really rightly pointed out, don't actually per se have an aftermath because they're ongoing.
Oh, I was just going to add, I think there isn't an answer to this. I think it's such a personal thing, but I would say with compassion, that's the only way to conduct research in the current state. You know, grief and loss are perpetual things, that they're not limited by time. And I feel like the only way to approach these interactions with others who may have their own extremely traumatic experiences who are living under so much fear is to be compassionate with yourself and to be compassionate with others, and just radically so, which means sometimes stepping away, sometimes not picking up that interview, sometimes not, sometimes it's a yes, sometimes it's a no. And I think it's about setting firmer boundaries with yourself, but with others. And yeah, compassion and empathy.
If I can add to that, compassion and empathy, I would definitely agree with that. And the question somehow reminds me of the context of my research in northern Uganda, which I didn't speak about at all. I mean, when I went to Acholi, it was in some way, perhaps one could think of it as a comparable situation, in the sense that it was a few years after long civil war had ended, and there was a prevalent sense of the war affecting everybody's life, but in ways that were not very often verbalized. And I feel like for a huge part of my fieldwork, and also probably for the first year of coming home from fieldwork at that point, went into trying to understand how I could first conduct research and then write about it in what I think that term hesitant anthropology really speaks to somehow, that there are a lot of times when we shouldn't press a point, and we shouldn't ask people to explicate their feelings about something that is very difficult, and that we can share in ways that don't require always necessarily words. And I kind of feel that those kinds of reflections that people have written in contexts of war and trauma are probably very relevant to the present situation as well. And which reminds me that there's a lot of, or I've read research about researchers who do field work in very difficult situations, and for instance, in cases of genocide, which show the level of people leaving academia after doing research on such themes is much, much higher than it is for people who study less somehow emotionally taxing themes. And now we're all confronted with a situation all over the world where we're doing research in taxing difficult situations, because everyone's living this situation. And I kind of feel like the idea of finding ways for academic institutions to actually make space for the fact that we're all kind of struggling, both individually and in our fieldwork, is just so incredibly important. So yeah, my answer would be to say that maybe, yeah, with empathy, maybe that's what I'd say.
Michelle, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, I've actually been thinking a lot about this question as well, because during the pandemic, I've been working with a research assistant who has been calling families in India whose children have gotten cochlear implants through government programs. And we're trying to understand, what's happening with the implants, especially now during COVID. And there was a lot of, we felt very weird and very concerned about whether we should be making these calls at all, and especially now. And what's been interesting is it seems like there's this tension in some ways between people grieving and experiencing loss, and then also trying to hold on to and create ideas of normalcy, and people are moving between these poles, and so it's been really interesting to me to think about, how do we also move between those poles? How do we move with folks, so that it's, working with students now, it's been interesting to see how many of the funding agencies require a plan B. They all want to know, what are you going to be doing with your research in this time of COVID, and how is COVID impacting your research? And on one hand, I think that's a really important and really valid question. But I think on the other hand, it's also, again, really important to hold on to and look at the creative world making things that people are doing to endure, to use Banerjee's phrase, or to sustain or to move on, right? So I guess this question of how do we move between these poles with people is something that I've been thinking a lot about.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you all for these really wonderful papers and for really, I think, also helping us push the question of refusal as well. I think the papers made clear that you know, we can say no to certain kinds of things, that we can refuse certain kinds of vulnerabilities as well. And I think that's very powerful. Because of time, we're actually gonna pause here and take just a 5-minute break. And then I hope everyone can come back for the performance by the Sonic Melting Collective. So we're very excited for that. I think it's going to tie in really well with what we've been discussing here. So please feel free to take a little break, and we'll see you back here very shortly. Thank you so much again to our amazing panelists and to everyone for your questions and comments.